Hello and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
And today we're joined by Keon West, who is a professor and a social psychologist, and he's joining us today to talk about his second book, The Science of Racism. Keon, welcome to the Prospect Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Keon, so your book, The Science of Racism, was published in January, and it advocates for a kind of different approach for understanding racism. Can you just start off by telling us why you wanted to write this book?
I have had, for a very long time, the disconcerting sense of living in a world where there's quite a lot of knowledge, but in which most people didn't have it. And that deeply affected the conversations that people had about different things. I guess the metaphor I've used a lot, that you've probably heard me use in other places, is that it feels a bit like being a modern day medical doctor who is transported back in time about 500 years or 1,000 years or however long ago it is, to a point where people didn't know that germs existed. And so they really think diseases are caused by spirits. And so people are doing all these things. They're saying, oh, well, that person really has the spirit of that. And, ooh, we should really fix the spirit of this in that person. And you could say, no, you just need to wash your hands. Trust me on this one. We know how this works. It's just washing your hands. And it sounds bizarre and extreme, but I do think most social psychologists must feel this way, because when we talk about racism, the things we say lack even the most basic of scientific understandings of it. And it's not, saying that, oh, people are dumb. These are really intelligent people, ridiculously well-educated people, just not in this field. And the things they say are so off base, they're so wrong, and the things that they don't know are so basic and so simple that I thought it's ridiculous how widespread this ignorance is. And it can't take that long to explain it to people, so I thought, why don't I just explain it and see what happens then?
Debates about racism are obviously, as you alluded to just now, very loaded with emotion and ideology and misunderstanding and misinformation. Certainly debates about how racist the UK is or isn't. And in the book, you kind of you lay out from the beginning, I'm a scientist, I believe in science, I'm going to take a scientific approach to kind of showing the evidence, put it in front of you, check the research, see what you think. But you also write about very upsetting cases of racism in the book. You write about your own personal experiences of racism, and how that informs your understanding of this issue and why you wanted to write about it. And we were wondering how you kind of reconcile that emotion and the personal effect of racism alongside all that misunderstanding with this very sort of scientific approach.
Well, one of the ways I did it was to write about myself very, very little. So if you go through the book, my editors would push me. They'd say, "Oh, write a bit. Tell people a story. People want a story. They want to get to know you." And I don't think people do. And I think the editors were kind enough to let me get away with people not knowing me. So hopefully by the end of the book, people still don't know very much about me. I think it's actually quite hard to figure out who I'm voting for through that book. I think that's quite difficult. I think I do say up front what my family arrangement is, but I don't think you could read the book, just the book, instead of the preface, and figure out if I'm single, if I'm married to a woman or to a man, if I have no children or 10. I think it's hard to tell, because I didn't want the book to be about me, in much the same way I think if someone were to write a book about genetics or about black holes or about any other aspect of science, exactly how they feel isn't that interesting. Exactly what their genetic makeup isn't that interesting. I want to know the science of genes. And I think the readers deserve that. So people reading the book will go through it. And one person actually called the book cold. But they meant it as a compliment, and I took it as a compliment, in that they said it is about really upsetting stuff, and it does upset people. People have told me that they were shocked. One person who reviewed the book called it something like a bleak dystopian read. And I thought, wow, that's just real life. That is real life. What you're talking about is just an accurate description of reality. So there's definitely upsetting stuff in it, but I didn't approach it to upset people. That wasn't the goal. It wasn't to make people like me or dislike me or get on my side or find out about my life. it was just to tell them, this is what the science says. When you take the scientific method, you study racism, this is what you get on the other side. And if that's bleak and dystopian, that's a shame, but that is the world we live in.
I'd love to kind of get a bit of an understanding of what you mean when you talk about the science of racism. It seems important for us to do that. Maybe we should, define what we mean when we're talking about racism. So could you talk to us a bit about what racism is in your book and in your understanding?
Yes. So, I mean, I think we should also talk about what the science is, because those are the two halves of the book, the science of racism. And the scientific method is really just the basic method of inquiry about the world. So if you want to know something about the world, so you want to ask yourself, does vitamin C reduce how long we spend suffering the effects of a cold? That's a scientific question. Now, you could answer this in many ways. You could say, well, I believe deep down in my heart that vitamin C does or doesn't do this. Or you could say, well, based on my faith or my culture, it does or it doesn't. And these answers, people could do them, but we could see immediately why they're not good answers, why they are inadequate answers. They don't tell us about the basic factual reality of what vitamin C does for colds. We understand that. And so the scientific method is a way of asking questions, of separating people into an experimental and a control condition, giving some of them the vitamin C and some of them not, and then testing how long it takes and actually having a measure at the end to see how sick people are. That's science. Now, what I find interesting is that we understand this when it comes to things like vitamin C and to colds, or the effects of smoking, or the effects of eating sugar, or whatever else it is. But the second you say it about racism, people really get quite odd. People do accept things like, I feel like racism is a big deal, or as a so and so forth, my experience of life tells me that this is a racist country and that's not. Or, well, because of, my perspective or my culture, I don't think racism is an issue here. And I think that's equally ridiculous. Like, it's not how we figure out what's really going on. And I have to be careful with that, because racism makes people very upset. And it makes people upset on both sides. You tell people that racism is happening, they get really upset. They don't like it. But also, if you tell people, you can't say, because of my experience, I know this is happening with racism, they get really hurt, because some of these experiences are terrible and they hurt people's feelings, and you feel like you're invalidating what they're saying. But I'm not trying to invalidate. I'm saying there are better ways to do this. So when someone says this is the least racist country in the world, for example, you can test that. That is a numerical, empirical thing to say, and you can just test it. And so far, no person who's ever said that has been accurate about it. That's just not a thing that's true. But it is something you can test and you can show is not true, or you can show is true. And so the book is really about that, which I suppose means I should define what I mean by racism. So when I talk about racism, I don't talk about things that other people talk about a lot. People talk about intention. They talk about hatred. So people say, oh, you hate members of this group, or you really want to hurt members of that. I totally disregard in this book what your intentions are. In the book, I talk about any detectable difference in treatment that can only be explained by race and by nothing else. So if you have that, you have racism. And that means you're treating some races better than other races. And there's so many ways to test for this. The way I start with in the book is a thing that I call a CV experiment, which is very straightforward, in which you take a few hundred or a few thousand copies of a CV, exactly the same CV, and you distribute them. And even though they have all the same qualifications and experience and education and everything else, the only thing that's different is the apparent race of the person who's submitting the CV. So it looks like it's a white person doing it, or a black person doing it, or an Asian person doing it, or whatever else. Now, because all the CVs are exactly the same, they should get the same responses. They should get the same calls to interview, the same job offers, the same callbacks, the same offers of money. But they don't. They don't. And we know they don't because we've done this experiment so many times. We've been doing it for decades. And every time it's done, white people get more. Compared to black people, let's say in the UK, they get about 50% more callbacks. They get offered more money. They get more job interviews. They get more offers straight away of the job. They're less likely to have their references checked. There's so many things that are different. And we know that they're different. And so that's how we do science on racism. And you can do that with jobs, you can do it with doctors, you can do it with police officers, you can do it with children. And it doesn't really matter who you do it with, you always get that discrepancy. And that's how we know that racism is still an issue in contemporary society.
You also you cite in the book that by some surveys, half of Brits, and I think it's the same in other countries, you say as well, don't think that racism is an issue or doesn't exist in this country. You say that more than half think that ethnic minorities face less or the same discrimination as white people in most areas of life. But you've just mentioned the many CV experiments that have been done over, as you say, many decades. So there is evidence that this kind of racism exists. How else do we know? What other evidence is out there that you kind of go through in the book?
Well, there's so much. So I mentioned the CV experiment, and I briefly mentioned that you can do this with doctors and with children and with police officers and with whoever else. But I would like to say, on that 50% of people who don't believe it, I always find that such an interesting thing, because that is quite literally like being a doctor and saying 50% of people don't think diseases are caused by germs. It's as if the Flat Earth Society got up to 50% of the population. At this point, we'd have to acknowledge something truly terrible has happened. But what also frightens me is that the other 50% of people who do think racism is an issue often struggle to explain why. They struggle to give evidence for it. And I think that's a shame, because the evidence is there. So to answer the rest of your question, what is the rest of the evidence? So you can do this so many ways. Once you get the basic structure of the science in, you can do it a number of ways. So there's an experiment that I know about where, and I think I mention it in the book, in which you take the same essay, so you can do the same thing. You take the same essay and you give it to a lot of different teachers, except you put a white child's name at the top or a black child's name at the top, and the white child will get a higher grade for exactly the same essay. You can get teachers in a classroom and tell them to look out for the children who are behaving badly, and then you can fit eye tracking devices on them, and you can say, look out for the children who are behaving badly. And when you give them that instruction, and only when you give them that instruction, they start to stare at the black children and not at the white children, for example. You can give people, this is another experiment I did, descriptions of exactly the same crime. So you can take newspaper clippings of the crimes, and you can have a white name as the person who did the crime, or you could cut it out and replace it with, in the experiment I did, it was a Muslim name, and I understand Muslim is a religion and not a race, but for various reasons, when people run experiments on it, it's treated like a race, because they're not asking you how often you read the Quran. They're just looking at your face and your name and discriminating. So it functions much the same way. But when you do that, the Muslims are interpreted as guiltier and terroristier, even having done exactly the same things. You can show people exactly the same evidence, and they're more likely to find that the people who aren't white are guilty. And when they are guilty, they put them in prison for longer. It's just thousands. You can go down, and there's so many experiments. If you can think of something, in fact, I think maybe in many ways, an experiment that is one of my favorites, but also one of my least favorites for obvious reasons in the book, is one in which you put police officers and members of society into a little shooty simulator, like a video game simulator, where you're supposed to shoot people who have guns and not shoot people who don't have guns. And then you just vary the color of the people. And what you find is that they tend to make the mistake of not shooting white people who have guns and shooting people who aren't white but who don't have guns. And that's horrible, because I'm not white and I don't have guns. And it suggests that this isn't as much of an impediment to getting shot as one would like to believe.
Given how unequivocal that the scientific evidence is, and that you cite in the book, you mention in your book the Sewell report, which came out in 2021, where the government, former government, kind of said, had set up this inquiry into discrimination and racism, and kind of said there is no systemic racism. I'm paraphrasing here.
Yep.
In the UK anymore. How did you feel about that? I mean, you mentioned it critically in the book, but when you see something like that being put out as an official government position, how do you feel about that as a scientist who knows the evidence for this?
So I feel really kind of exhausted and irritated with them. I think the whole premise was deeply flawed. I mean, could you imagine, although this has happened in other countries, people doing similar things in ridiculous ways. So we could say, let's say now we're going to have a government commission. So I'm going to put together 10 people. Let's imagine Keir Starmer did that. Sir Keir Starmer, sorry, I don't mean to be impolite. So Sir Keir Starmer, current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, says, I'm going to put together a little commission, and we're going to sit down and we're going to figure out whether, sexually transmitted diseases are really caused by germs or whether they're just caused by the way people feel. And then they conclude that it's by the way people feel. And I think the conclusion is a mistake, obviously. But the very premise of what you're doing is a mistake. We have so much scientific research. This is a settled question and such an old question. It's a question with so many reams of data behind it that what you're doing is bizarre, arrogant, and misguided. What you should have done is sit down and check what the scientific literature says before you start doing this. Now, we wouldn't accept this, but interestingly, other countries would do that. So there was a period of time, particularly around HIV, when countries were doing things like that. Certain countries were doing something as ridiculous as that and saying, oh, it's not real. It's because you're not eating enough fruit. But we'd recognize that as arrogant, misguided, and dangerous. But when we do it about racism, we don't recognize it as arrogant, misguided, and dangerous. But it is. It's not just that they came to the wrong conclusions, but they should never have done that. What they should have done is educate themselves. But thankfully that's done now, so they're not doing that anymore. But it would be really great if the next time a government decided to commission a report on whether or not racism still exists, or the next time that the BBC decides to do a special on is there still racism in the UK, if they'd read just one scientific paper first, just read that one paper before you do that. I think it'd be incredibly helpful. And I don't discourage people from talking about racism, but I do think we can do better than does it exist. I think we can do so much better in the same way that we can do better than are diseases caused by germs? Should we wash our hands? I'm like, yes, the answer to both is yes. We should now be talking about better ways of handling disease.
From that kind of wealth of, scientific evidence, experiments that have been conducted, that you've talked about some different examples, I'd love to know about the kind of comparisons between countries. So we've been talking about the sort of UK context, and we've talked about kind of the institutional governmental response to the science, or lack of response to it perhaps in the UK. How similar is the situation in the UK compared to the US? People often draw parallels between anti-Black racism in America and here. What can we learn with that kind of comparison, and what does the science tell us about experiences in the different countries?
Yes, so the science definitely confirms that some countries are worse than other countries, but you have to be really quite specific about what you mean. So the beauty of the data is that now we have numbers. So we can run the same experiment in the UK versus the US, and we can do it a couple of different times. We actually do UK, US, Germany, France. We could do any country we want and then look at that discrepancy. And so if one country has about a 36% gap between the white and the black CVs, and the other country has about a 51% gap between the white and the black CVs, and you can say, well, this country is more racist than that country, for example. And that's actually true. The UK research shows a slightly bigger gap than the American research, which is an important thing to notice, because in the UK we often say that, oh, well, the Americans, they're very racist. We often say that about Americans. And sure, fine, they are, especially with some of the recent political changes. But I think when British people say that we're not, I always wonder, what is that based on? What have you done to determine that British people aren't? And if you run the same experiment in the two countries, you get similar results, with actually the UK gap between white people and Afro-Caribbeans being slightly bigger than in the United States of America. Of course, the thing about numbers is they can also get complex. So when you run similar experiments, not just in the US and the UK, but you take it to France, for example, what you find there is that you get different patterns of discrimination. So let's take two patterns in particular that are interesting when you consider those three countries, the US, the UK, and France. The US has a racial category that the UK does not, which is Latinos or Hispanic or whatever else you want to call it. But the UK does not recognize this category as a racial category. They're just white for the most part. That's what we think. Now, this gets into complex conversations about who's white really. Is race made up? Yes, it is. And there are better books than mine about why it's made up. But if you invent a racial category and then treat people differently, you have to count that in the experiments. And so what you find is that there are other categories in the US that are treated differently that aren't treated differently in the UK. But the other interesting finding is who gets treated the worst. A lot of the French findings, for example, show that North Africans are particularly unpopular in France in a way that they're not in the UK, where Afro-Caribbeans tend to be particularly unpopular in the UK. And it gets interesting and fascinating and dazzling. But what I think is, for me, the best thing is that the next time someone says, well, I want to know, like, are we the least racist country in the world? I want to say, about what? Is it about employment? Is it about police officers shooting people? Is it about dating? Is it about friendships? Because whatever it is, we've measured it and we can tell you. We can tell you which countries were better than and which countries were worse than. And so you can't just blithely say we're the least racist country, because that's not true, and it's provably not true.
Also, presumably, people should aim to not be racist at all, rather than to be
just
that's another point. But, your book is such a kind of powerful advocation. I think that's even a word for science. It's a book about racism, but you said it's a book about, you're almost arguing for the role of science in public debate and public policy, for science to be taken seriously. And, we're living in a time, you alluded to what's happening in the US, the new US government, we're at a time of alternative facts, post-fact, so many vicious debates about so many things where people just don't even agree on the basic facts. Is science kind of your answer to this? Do you think it can really break through some of that misinformation and the real difficulty at the moment of having any kind of conversation with anyone?
Yes, so science is definitely my answer. I accept and I acknowledge that people believe things for reasons that aren't scientific. I also believe things for reasons that aren't scientific, some things anyway. But I have to admit that when it matters to me, when it really matters to me that my belief is grounded in the accuracy of the real world, then I do defer to science. And I think that's important. I don't think science will convince everyone, but I think not using science will convince significantly fewer people and will be much less likely to get them to accurate beliefs. And I think we say we've been using science for a long time, but we haven't. One example I like to use. So let's totally ignore the fact that even very intelligent people I like and respect, will just say, yes, racism's got better because, well, I just don't experience it as much anymore. And I think we would never accept this about anything else. We would not say the rates of car accidents have gone down because you personally have seen fewer of them. It would be a bizarre thing to say. We track these numbers, but we say it with racism. But let's ignore that. Let's ignore all of that. Let's talk about COVID. It's another example that I've used before. So I don't know I assume you believe COVID was a real thing, that it really existed. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Dangerous question.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Okay. I thought I'd check. I mean, I believed it was a real thing. I assume at some point in your lives you wore masks while in public for some things. Okay. So also nodding. And again, I did as well. But if you ask most people, why did you wear the mask? What experiment showed that wearing the mask was better than not wearing the mask? What did they do and what did they find? Most people, even the people who wear masks, cannot answer that question. And to the best of our knowledge, there is no experiment. I mean, I'm sure there must be, otherwise people wouldn't say that. But we're not actually trusting the science, we're trusting the scientists. The scientists come on television or on radio and say, just wear the mask. Trust us, we're scientists. And, a lot of people, depending on their political orientation and their inclination towards science, say, yeah, sure, that sounds fine. I'll just wear the mask. But that's not trusting science. That's trusting scientists. And I actually really aggressively move away from that. There's a whole chunk in the book, in the early chapters, where I actually tell people to be very skeptical of anyone who shows up and says, I'm a fancy person with a fancy degree. And they start saying words like Oxford and Harvard and Cambridge and Yale and so on. People only do that when they're trying to lie to you. If they had something honest, if they had truth to tell you, they'd just tell you what the experiment was and what they found. They'd say, we took 1,000 CVs, 500 of them had white names, 500 of them had black names. Here's the rates of return on white. Here's the rates of return on black. Done. Nobody needs to mention Harvard. It is not necessary. So I really try to say that the science is the answer. because I also think what we've been doing for so long is not using the science. What we've been doing for a long time is using arguments for authority. And I do think, or from authority, and I do think that people are right to be tired of those and right to be skeptical of them and right to recognize that they're not very good. If you have science, just tell us what the science is. It's really not that difficult. Just do it. And people will be more likely to believe you.
So, I mean, it seems like if we're thinking about how we tackle racism in society, there's sort of one part that's about the communication of information, that being good information.
Yes.
There's another part that's about how equipped we are as individuals in the public to kind of critically assess the information that we're given and figure out what we think about it, what we believe. Could you talk a bit about how equipped you think we are as a kind of British public to do that and how it might be improved?
So I think being equipped to handle it comes in two flavors. So one, I think, is generally the flavor people are asking about, which is whether people are intelligent enough to understand what's happening and be able to interpret that. And I think for the most part, the answer to that is yes. I think there are obvious areas of complication that make it hard. So some of the statistics to do with experiments are genuinely difficult. I do not know the proportion of the British public that truly understands power analyses, but I'm assuming it's incredibly low. I think the number of people who genuinely get what p-values are and the pros and cons of using them, incredibly low. So if you're a person who's listening and you understand both those things, you are in a very tiny minority of the statistically competent of the UK, and that is fine. I don't think you have to feel bad about that. I just think those things are genuinely hard. I do think that other things like experimental design are quite easy, that you can explain to people why you need a control condition or the experiment doesn't work. You should explain to people why the experiment should be everyone should be anonymous. You shouldn't know which condition people are in when you're doing the experiment. People can understand why that would affect the results. People could understand why you should run an experiment more than once, why sometimes a result could be a fluke, and the more often you run the experiment, the more confident you should be in the findings. That part people can understand, and I think that part is not that difficult, and I've explained it to many people, not just reams of undergrad students, so many undergrad students over the course of my life, but also to people who are not undergrads. And some of these people are children, and they just get it. I have a son who is 10, and he gets it. It's not that difficult. I do think there is a second part, which has come out a bit. And it comes out a lot, for example, in discussions of colorblindness, which I always find so interesting because people really get attached to it. And there's an emotional attachment to colorblindness. And it doesn't matter sometimes what you tell people. You can show them. You can say, look, we're going to take 100 people and we'll make 50 of them really endorse colorblindness, and we'll make 50 of them do something else, and then we'll test them in various ways to see how racist they are. And look, the colorblind people are more racist all the time. And you can show people these experiments over and over again. And what I find interesting is the number of people who, instead of saying, oh, well, that's a shame, I won't do that again then, say, how dare you? And they just get angry and they don't really respond scientifically.
Do you want to briefly explain, because some people actually might not be familiar with what colorblindness is? Could you explain what it is?
Sure. So colorblindness is a strategy for managing racial tension. It is actually, in many ways, a very popular strategy, particularly among white people. White people very much like it. And colorblindness is approaching race from the perspective of, if I do not notice race, I cannot be racist. So the issue here is acknowledging race and racial differences. And if you get rid of that acknowledgement, then you're not going to be racist. So it comes out in comments like, oh, I don't think of you as a black person, or I don't even know which of my neighbors are black, and things like that. Anything where you don't notice or pretend not to notice who is not the same race as yourself. And what's interesting is if you conduct research on colorblindness, which I have also done, it is associated with being more racist in, I think, every way people have figured out how to measure racism than if you just didn't do it. And I have shown people the experiments, and I am impressed sometimes. at how much they don't like it. And it is one of those instances where you can see that emotion can get in the way of scientific understanding. And I'm not sure how much people are ready for that part of it. I'm not sure what to do about that. I assume a lot of these people go home and calm down and have a bit of a think and a cup of tea, and then maybe they reconsider their approach later, even if they don't say that to my face. But I think at least some people value accuracy enough that even if it doesn't gel well with their emotion, they just want to do the thing that is most accurate.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you one final question, if that's okay.
Yes.
Right towards the end of your book, you talk about how, you say, I could have written a book on sexism. I wrote a book on, there are so many things that intersect, that are problems on top. It's much harder to be a Black woman than a Black man, for example, in all sorts of ways. Yeah. For example, in the CV experiments that you talked about before. Yeah. And you also talk about these experiences you've had of sort of sitting in kind of committee rooms or meeting rooms, trying to think of like, what do we do? What anti-racist action do we do? And it gets kind of bogged down in, but what about sexism? What about all the other things, And I wondered if you could maybe leave our listeners with a bit of a sense of what is it that you think can be done, to the best thing that can be done to act and kind of get out of that sort of paralysis of we can't, if we can't fix anything, we fix nothing.
Yes. So I think another way sometimes people put this, sometimes they say to me, do you ever think we'll get rid of racism completely? And I say, well, no, probably not. And then they say, well, why do this? What is the point of all of this? And I always think, what an odd question. No one ever goes to the doctor and then angrily shouts, do you think I'll live forever? I mean, maybe some people do, but they're very odd. And then if the doctor says, no, unlikely, you'll almost certainly be dead within 40 years, then what's the point? And they storm out of the office. Well, you could live longer and you could be healthier while you do. And whether we get rid of racism, I think, is an interesting question. But we could certainly make it less, right? That is within our power. We know how to do that. And I think we should, if we know how to do it. You're right, of course, when I said I could have written another book. And many people, I think, don't realize this, but I also have done a lot of research about sexism. I've done a lot of research about anti-gay prejudice and anti-immigrant prejudice. I just wouldn't be so bold as to write a book called The Science of Sexism as a man, or The Science of Anti-Gay Prejudice as a heterosexual person. I just think that's a bit of cheek, and I should probably not be the person to do that. I am an immigrant, so I could have written that one, but I wanted to do the racism one. That one seemed like the one I had to get off my chest first. And I do understand that the world is incredibly complicated, but I also understand that the people who are out there doing racist and sexist and anti-gay stuff aren't, they're not fighting with each other before they do the racism. It's I've never seen or heard of the English Defence League writing to the Ku Klux Klan saying your racist behavior isn't nearly racist enough. It's not perfectly racist. You must stop immediately. No, they'll just do the imperfect racism. They will carry on with racism because they want to do the racist things. I find it's curiously the anti-racist people who are hesitant to act unless it's perfect. And I think when you look at how that dynamic functions, what you end up doing is getting racist people doing a lot of racist stuff quite quickly and quite effectively because they have a clarity of purpose that the anti-racist people do not seem to share. And I know that it's better to not make mistakes and make things worse. I advocate for not messing things up and for paying attention and learning the science. But I also advocate for doing something. If we refuse to do anything, we should not kid ourselves. All the people who want a world that we actively hate are working on it right now. Like this very second, they're doing racist stuff now, and we are doing nothing to counter them. We can't let that stand.
Keon West, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for telling us about your book, The Science of Racism, and we'll make sure to share some information on it for our listeners. So thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a lovely conversation.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.